Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Liminal Space, a podcast that seeks to explore and reimagine the world in which we live. Today I'm super excited to share this episode with you, a discussion with Cyrus Shahrad. Cyrus is a British Iranian musician, releasing music under the name HIATUS. His music combines soft piano melodies with electronic music and haunting soundscapes, heavily influenced by his Iranian roots and film soundtracks, which takes listeners on deep and hypnotic journeys. The music you are hearing now is a song called Distancer, the title track of Cyrus's upcoming album, and you're also seeing images from the video that he just released for the track. Cyrus is also a journalist, novelist and film critic, using his writing to explore and attempt to make sense of the world around him. Cyrus creates art that's meaningful, beautiful and authentic, and it was a real thrill to be able to have this discussion with him to discover the human behind the music and also his own personal and musical journey. To see more discussions like this, subscribe and hit the bell button below to be notified of new episodes. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. But for now, make yourself comfortable as we enter a liminal space with Cyrus Shahrad. Hi Cyrus.
Hello mate.
Thanks for taking the time to come on a liminal space.
It's a real pleasure, and as I think I said to you just now, this is the first time I've done one of these video interviews, so if I look a bit kind of startled at any point, it's just trying to get used to it. But it's a real pleasure to be here, mate. Thanks
Perfect. So I really look forward to, obviously music is how you spend most of your creative time these days, but I really like to have a chat about your music, your art, your philosophies, your ideas. Let's start in music. What is it about music? What's the power of music that, I guess, you chose that, you've done many things in your life. What is it about music that's so powerful for you?
That's a really good question. That's the last question in Almost Famous, isn't it? Have you seen Almost Famous? Cameron Crowe film.
Long time ago.
About a music journalist, and at the end he finally gets around to doing the interview with the band that he's been following around, and he says, "What is it that you love about music?" And the guy says, "To begin with, everything." I think that's the final line in the film, something like that. It's a really difficult question. It is kind of everything. I mean, music is sort of, there's all these, I read about it sometimes, and there are people that try and sort of differentiate what, music from other kinds of art. I feel like music for me is more immediate, certainly, than, I guess, writing's the other thing that I've spent a lot of time doing, and writing always feels more like work. Music, when it happens, like naturally, can feel really instantaneous, really spontaneous. This, like that feeling of kind of channeling something else, like something else is kind of using you as a sort of vessel or whatever. It's really kind of cheesy, but it still happens. It doesn't happen all that often, but when it happens, it's just magic. And I think music is kind of, I guess there's a universality about it that it's sort of outside of us. It isn't dependent on language, so we're not like, we're not divided between people who speak music and people who don't. And it's a kind of like, it's something. Yeah, I always feel like the idea of a soundtrack to life has always appealed to me. The idea that there's a kind of like that there can be some sort of musical accompaniment to the events of our lives, which is maybe something that we get from cinema growing up. We watch so much TV and so many films where there is this musical accompaniment to everything.
Is it sort of the lack of intellect in a way? It's sort of more a feeling and an emotion rather than with words, obviously, is more intellectual in a sense?
Yeah, I think, I haven't really thought about it in these terms, but yeah, like, I think that is true. In the past, I've worked with one musician, certainly, who kind of, accused me is a, she wasn't really accusing me, but she said, you intellectualize music too much. It's too much in your head. You don't kind of just do enough stuff. I don't know. Maybe that's true. I think that it is possible for it to be kind of really pure and really you know, really kind of like, you know, unintellectual. And maybe that is kind of when it's at its best. At the same time, I do like music that's really kind of thought-provoking and that really kind of challenges you. I mean, I've been listening to, last night I've been doing some decorating in my flat. I was listening to Johan Johansson's soundtrack for this film that he made before he very sadly passed away, First and Last Men. And it's like this modern classical thing, but it is really, you know, it's unbelievably beautiful, but it's really incredibly, I don't know how to put it other than to say it's really smart. It's really, you know, there's so much going on. There's so many kind of, it's so unexpected and unpredictable. I do like that too. I like being kind of challenged by music. So there's a mix, but I think the fact that it is detached from language is so important. You know, and I guess rhythm and melody are two very different things, but obviously we're connected to such an ancient tradition in terms of our reliance on those things for kind of connection to something bigger than us. You know, I guess that's the idea of people dancing to beats long before we had the power to communicate with words is really appealing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's that too, definitely.
And I mean, I don't think it's at all cheesy or anything. I mean, everything you say, I resonate with deeply. Also, this idea of, you know, like us being a conduit or some sort of bridge between something or somewhere else. And do you have any idea what's on the other side of that bridge? Where are you channeling?
Well, no, I don't know. That I think is, I guess that kind of comes down to whether you believe that, you know, the experience of sort of life is out there or in here. You know, I think it's kind of both. I think that maybe sometimes when music is at its most kind of powerful as a kind of creator, as you know, it's a bit of a grand word, but when you are kind of making music in that way, I think a lot of what you're doing is not so much kind of, I don't know, maybe it's less that you're channeling something and more that you're bypassing something. You know, you're not like burdened by all of the sort of debris of day-to-day life. You don't have that sort of, you know, you're not so overwhelmed by the self, I guess, the idea of who you are, the sort of all of the kind of stuff that you carry around with you, and you just kind of let go of all that. And then, I mean, I guess that's kind of fundamentally what meditation is. You know, it's kind of finding that yeah. But in terms of what is kind of channeling or being channeled, that's a question I don't think I have the answer to.
Yeah, if you did,
if I did,
you would be the one.
Yeah, I'd be the one. Yeah, I'll come back to you if I ever do come across that information.
So when I listen to your music, which, let me try to intellectualize it or to explain it in a sense. You know, it's very cinematic. For me, it's very deep. It takes me on a journey. It's a soundscape in some sense. And it does make me want to close my eyes and to be taken somewhere, which for me, it's very similar to, I mean, it is a meditation. It is a meditation. Can you share, are there any personal experiences both as a creator and as a listener that demonstrate just how profound music can be?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, growing up, music was something that I kind of like, I had a sort of relationship with it where I love to make it. I love to kind of, I mean, I love to sort of, to play music, and I played the piano growing up. Although I had lessons on the piano, I wasn't really like a natural pianist. I actually I really struggled with reading music, and you know, to the despair of my sort of piano teacher, never really made any kind of ground in that way. Never got any grades. Never ascended that sort of like thing. But the experience of just playing stuff spontaneously for me was kind of magical. And I think I was kind of seeking like those experiences very young, where music kind of transformed the world into something more than it was. I mean, I think we get like really jaded by the world really young, you know, even as kind of a kid, I was looking for something to make it more special. And music was, I think, that thing. I remember like whenever there was a power cut, which happened a lot when we were kids, or maybe that was just a thing growing up in the 80s, like the power would go out quite a lot in our house. And I would always go straight to the piano, playing the piano in the dark, like without, I mean, obviously I could have at any point just turned the lights off in a room that I was in, but it never occurred to me to do that. But when the power went out and I would go and sit at the piano and just play music without being able to see the keys, I remember that being like sort of transforming the world into something sort of other, And I also remember, I remember kind of relying on music to do sort of magical things. There's a really there's a really embarrassing story about this. I'm not even going to go into it, but yeah, I did expect, I did hope for music to kind of like transform things in some sort of way. But I also remember like just finding music so moving. I remember listening to Iranian music as a kid in my when my dad was driving. He didn't play Iranian music all the time because I grew up in the UK for the most part, and he wouldn't play Iranian music a great deal. But when he was driving, and he would often drive us quite early in the morning if we were going on like long trips we used to go and stay with my mum's parents who lived in Dorset. It's like 3-hour plus drive. We would always leave like before dawn, and he would always just pile us in the car and everyone would go to sleep, or at least he thought everyone was asleep, and he would put on these old Iranian tapes of like Iranian music. And I just remember sitting in the back of the car listening to them. I remember them kind of being so sort of familiar and so sort of foreign at the same time, seeming so strange, but like that I think kind of stayed with me in a way. Like definitely when I finally came back to kind of listening to Iranian music much later on, that I think had been sort of carried through in some way. So yeah,
I've spent time in Iran. In 2004, I was almost 2 months in Iran.
Okay.
And
fantastic!
More than fantastic. The country, the people, the music, the culture, the stories,
that's wonderful.
the poetry. The poetry is something that I don't even know how to sort of express, or in my limited time there. I mean, the best way possibly I could try is to tell my own small story. So sometimes I was traveling on buses, and going back to your idea that music cuts across languages and cultures and barriers. So I couldn't speak. I mean, I don't speak Farsi, and these people that I was with didn't speak English. And
you were traveling around the country, or
I was traveling. I was traveling around the country.
Yeah.
And I was alone for most of it. And I had a scrapbook, a diary, just to scribble on. And so often, whoever I was sitting next to would ask me to take my book. And I mean, I'm from Australia. If you're on a bus in Australia and some teenager takes your book, you're probably going to get something rude or something like this.
Yeah.
More often than not, I would get my book back and there would be beautiful poetry or a beautiful drawing or something really, really profound. And again, that may be sort of a silly story, but it's something that really sticks with me.
No, not at all. It's really funny, actually. There's something similar-ish. I know exactly what you mean, and I know exactly how that happens and why that happens. And I remember I was in Iran with my dad like a couple of years ago, and we were, again, it was like we were somewhere in the center of Tehran. We were trying to get a bus to the west. And it was a nightmarish journey. We'd got one bus to this really busy roundabout, and we were standing at this roundabout. It was just hordes of people, everyone kind of crushed together. And I was really like resentful that we'd done this instead of just getting a taxi. It's just like, why does my dad always make us get these buses? We could just so easily just get in a cab and be there in like 20 minutes. And my dad was completely like unsure where he was, where to go, what bus to get, and he just went up to this guy who was like a guard at the bus stop and said, like, where do we get the bus to Shahrad or wherever we were going? And this guy, like, he was just looking kind of really like abstractly at his hand, and he just kind of looked up at my dad and went, what is this? And he was holding this like flower. I think it was like a jasmine flower or something, but he was just like, what is this? Like this, what is this beautiful smell? What is this beautiful flower? And my dad was like, jasmine flower. He's like, oh, jasmine flower. It's just like, this guy is obviously at work at probably the busiest time of the day, you know.
In the middle of the
he's having
chaos.
this kind of like, in the middle of this utterly chaotic kind of central Tehran roundabout, and he's just having this really profound moment of like communion with the universe. I think poetry, I mean, it all I think stems from like, there is an Iranian affinity with poetry, which is very unlike, certainly, you know, my experience of poetry growing up at school. You know, we were taught poetry, we were taught to try and write poetry, you know, and I've worked as a teacher, and I know that still kind of happens, but the connection with poetry is almost like, no, obviously young people in the UK still have that connection. They still, that, you know, kids who have something they want to express will sometimes find that poetry is a better vehicle for that than anything else they've come across so far, and they'll get into writing poetry and they'll have really, really profound experiences with it. But it's in Iran, it's just like, it's like in the blood. It's just, you know, certainly my dad's generation, and I think still now, you know, people are raised in Iran with those poems kind of as a like blueprint for living. You know, it's like a template for life, like the work of the ancient poets and you know, modern poets. Just the tradition of writing this way, and yeah, I mean, it is kind of powerful, and it is beautiful. I'm really glad you've been there. It's great that you had that experience.
I had just the most amazing experience, and anytime I meet Iranians on my travels, always happy to share, you know, some of
that's wonderful.
Some of the most deep experiences of my life were in Iran, and I learnt so much. And not only did I learn so much, I had everything that I was, you know, that I'd been told was turned on its head very, very quickly. Hospitality was just incredible and really touching. What about your own personal journey or experience my understanding is your father's Iranian, your mother's British.
Yeah, that's right.
Born in Iran, perhaps raised in
I spent the first year and a half or so of my life in Iran, and following the revolution, we moved with my mum and dad back here. Didn't go back there. I went back there kind of in the early 80s when there was, you know, war with Iraq going on. It was very sort of unstable, and you know, I mean, it's never been necessarily easy going back, but I think it was difficult when I was very young. So my parents didn't really travel back we went back in the 80s once, in the 90s once, and it was tough. And it wasn't really until my 20s that I started going back regularly. At that point, I hadn't really kind of had a connection with Iran for, you know, like 10 or 15 years. And I didn't really speak Farsi. I basically kind of like made myself sort of reintegrate with that part of my life. You know, I felt like there was an absence. You know, I felt like there was like something missing, and I went back there. In fact, in 2004, so the same year you were there, I went back for the first time in, like I say, sort of over a decade, and just felt immediately like a connection, a kind of coming home. It was kind of overwhelming, and I subsequently went back kind of every year. So until obviously very recently with the pandemic, I've been going back every year since then for like at least a couple of weeks. Stayed there for a few months in 2005 and kind of worked there for a bit. I've gone back for sort of longer periods of time, travelled around a fair amount, but generally just the experience of going and staying with my dad's family in Tehran was enough to kind of like reinvigorate that side of myself. And it's still to this day, you know, it's still you know, I still find just even the practice of just like practicing Farsi, you know, of an evening, just like reading basic books in Farsi, like watching TV in Farsi. It's like I just find it a joy. I just find it kind of enriches some side of me, which I think I feel blessed. Obviously, I think anyone with like two homes is like twice as lucky as someone who has one. I mean, you can see just like the degree of just hatred that is born of nationalism.
Yeah.
Anyone who's just like obsessed with their kind of like what they see as their homeland and their flag. And I just think having that duality makes you realize how nonsensical that is. I mean, obviously I have, profound love for both the UK and Iran. I can also see that both are like incredibly flawed places. And maybe as a result, I'm less likely to kind of, pick a side. Yeah.
And what about musically? You've been generous enough to give me a preview listen to your new album, Distancer, which is not far away from being released. And
no, not far.
That sounds like it's more heavily influenced by Iranian music. You have an amazing singer who I think sings on 3 or 4 of the tracks.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that something you're consciously doing to reconnect with your Iranian heritage?
What happened really was that when I went kind of in that like middle of the noughties, it was like 2004, 2005, I was already doing music. I was working as a journalist, and that was why I was over in Iran originally. But I was doing music, I was making music, and I had started doing stuff as HIATUS, or like under that name, just kind of making kind of EPs. Hadn't really sort of settled, hadn't found a sound, I guess. When I was in Iran, that was when I kind of started listening to Iranian music, started kind of digging through my dad's old records and kind of finding this, I don't know, just like, I think it was that connection, it was those car journeys, it was like, that was that thing that was there all along. My music had always tended towards a sort of melancholy, which is unfortunate because, I'm increasingly convinced that, that kind of emotional content isn't always that helpful, but there was always that kind of like underlying sort of lament and nostalgia to the stuff that I was making. And it was only when I started listening to Iranian music again that I was like, oh, maybe this is where that comes from. Because this was at a time when a lot of electronic music was much less, I don't know. I think the tendency was like away from emotion. Like it was like people were kind of getting away from that, I think. And I was just like trying to, I don't know, that's a terrible generalization. I don't, that's not necessarily true. But I found in Iranian music, a sort of, some kind of like confirmation of something that I'd been looking for, and then I started sampling it. So like the first records that I did had, samples of Iranian instruments and sometimes vocals. In terms of this record, actually, I wasn't expecting for it to have this Iranian sort of center to it. I mean, as you say, it's probably the most Iranian record that I've made. I wasn't expecting that to happen with this one. But I was working on a track, and I wanted to record a kamanche, which is an Iranian string instrument. And a friend put me in touch with Faraz, who is a very talented kamanche player who is now a very good friend of mine. And we went and recorded him on this one track, and it was just such an incredible experience that I just knew that I wanted him to be on more. I wanted him to be on as many of the tracks on this record as I could. And then when I suddenly thought how great it would be to have a vocalist. Do you know any Iranian singers? And he said, well, my wife's an Iranian singer. My wife Malahat. So he was very kind of, he wasn't like, you must listen to my mate. He was just like, well, she might not be kind of the sort of singer you're looking for. I was like, well, let's get together and see what happens. And of course she was absolutely perfect, and subsequently sang on 3 of the songs on the record. So it did end up being a very strongly Iranian kind of centered record, but in a way that was, I think, also much more genuine. It was an experience recording as well, because in the past it's been very much like, getting little snippets of Iranian music and feeling like a sort of an outsider peering in. But to be in the room with these guys, making this music and just feeling, it felt like it felt like a sort of completion. And I, you know, I don't want to say like the kind of culmination of a process, but certainly like, you know, it felt very rooted in that whole journey of, you know, sitting in the car, listening to the music as a kid, going to Iran and kind of rediscovering it and incorporating it into my own stuff. And then finally, you know, working with these incredibly gifted Iranian musicians. It was such a blessing. And, you know, I'm really excited for people to hear it.
And when's that going to be released?
I hope now it looks like February, but there's going to be some stuff from it coming out before then. So I'm going to kind of drip feed stuff from it. Like, you know, like songs will be appearing very soon. I think the first one will be in the next couple of weeks. And then, you know, give people, just kind of like give people stuff to listen to over the coming months. And then just put, I mean, I imagine by the time it's up in February, people would have heard most of it anyway. So.
And it sounds like, I mean, that's a really interesting, it's something I think about a lot, this idea of being open creatively in the sense of, you know, you said it wasn't your intention to have this, you know, more Iranian influence, but, and if you were closed, perhaps you know, you could have turned your back to that and it wouldn't have, it sounds like you're really happy with the finished product. It's an amazing album. How do you, or with HIATUS, how do you work with that? Do you have a direction? Do you have a focus? Are you trying to do something with your music, or are you actually doing the opposite? Are you sort of allowing magic to happen?
I would say it's that's a tough one because I suppose in a way I feel like now I just want to make music that people like. I want to make music for people. It's not like, I mean, I do still have moments where I just kind of, I sit at home and I play, you know, the equivalent of like a power cut where I'll just sit at the piano. You know, I still have those moments of like kind of musical communion, but I feel like I need to, it's not like I need to make music to please people, but I want to make music that I guess helps people, that makes other people's lives a bit, I don't know, like saying making other people's lives better is I'm not saying like I have the power to kind of improve the lives of other people, but if I can do something that's just helping in some way, that would be, so if people seem to like it, then I'll just do stuff that I guess people want to hear. There was a time a while ago where I was kind of like, I just felt a little bit over the whole electronic thing, and I was like, I'd really like to start making stuff that's just a bit more like, because I used to play in bands and I used to kind of really thrive on the sort of improvisational nature of like performance with other people. You know, I love playing live. I love the idea that you play differently every night. Every song would be different every time. And there's something quite rigid about certainly like the way that I produce music. And I kind of wanted to shape that. And I started experimenting with stuff that was a bit less rigid, that was a bit more kind of organic. And after a while, I was just like, oh, you know, there's a place for this. But also I kind of want to do stuff that is going to make people happy, you know, that I think people want to hear. At the same time, doing the stuff with like, you know, Iranian vocalists, I don't know. I mean, I get a lot of pleasure out of it. But it's tough. I mean, you know that making music, I'm not implying that it's difficult compared to like being a nurse or something like that. But mentally, it's often not a hugely enjoyable process. Like certainly those kinds of feverish, like, you know, nights creating are amazing. But then the weeks or months of, you know, editing and mixing and mastering, for me, are basically nightmarish. You know, I saw an interview with Hilary Mantel, who wrote the I haven't read them actually. In fact, I'm not sure I've read. Historical fiction isn't really a thing that I'm into, but this author I saw an interview with, the kind of the headline was something like writing isn't fun, but then fun has never been a kind of priority of mine. And I sort of thought that's an interesting, you know, I can get on board with that. I feel like, you know, much as I like enjoying myself, I feel like making music isn't that much fun as a livelihood. You know, it's a great there's a great kind of pleasure in sort of seeing it out there and knowing that people are enjoying it. But the process of making music I find quite torturous.
I don't think you're alone there, and I don't think it's just with music. I mean, I produce music, I make films, and there hasn't been a song, or there hasn't been a film, or there hasn't been a project in which halfway through I've wished I never began because I became lost in it, or there is a pressure also, whether that's a pressure of an audience or an internal pressure on ourselves.
I think so. I think that there's so many reasons why. I think I'm definitely a perfectionist in when it comes to music, and that's unfortunate because I'm also incompetent when it comes to kind of mixing and mastering. So I have this like desire for things to be really, really I have this vision of how I want them to be. Funnily enough, as an aside, I've been kind of decorating. I think I might have mentioned in my flat, and I took on this since I finished the record, I was like, I need something to fill my time, so I'm going to refurbish the windows in this flat. I live in this flat with these old steel windows, so I kind of stripped them and kind of reglazed them and painted them, and I had this idea in my head that it was going to be just this incredible improvement. It was going to be so much better, so beautiful. And while I started working on them, I was like, oh wow, I'm actually making these worse. My skills in this are so limited that the image I had in my head was so different from the reality. Why am I saying this? Because I think something similar happens with music. When I started out, I had this image of I wanted the music to sound like this, but I was somewhere over here. And over the years, I've kind of learned to get a little closer to the image that I have of it, but it's never quite there. I'm never able to kind of reproduce exactly what I hear. And I torture myself trying to get it. With the windows, I was like, oh, do you know what? It's fine. Actually, the fact that I've tried is the thing. I gave it a go, and I will always be able to say that I painted these windows. I didn't get someone else to do it. But with music, it's never enough. It's no, this has to be right. This has to be right. So I think what's the difference? That it never gets easier. I get more kind of competent at knowing how things work and plugins and software and hardware and stuff like that. But it never gets. The mental process never gets easier. I think the only thing that's different is I know the kinds of traps that my mind is going to set for myself. So it's not an unfamiliar experience. When I was starting out, I was like, why am I going in these horrible circles over and over again, making these changes that no one can hear? And even after a while, I can't hear. I'm like, hold on, which version was this? Is this the kick up or down? Or the only difference now is that I kind of, when that's happening, I can't stop going into that, but I know it's coming. And when it happens, I'm like, okay, now I'm in that bit with the thing, but it'll pass, and it does pass, and then I'm kind of out the other side of it.
I find it incredible. I've been listening to your music for years. I love your music. I take as much pleasure looking at the comments below, because a lot of your music is sort of released as film, kind of hybrid film.
That's right.
And you are touching people in such magical ways, and it's a little odd to hear sort of the internal torturous process, then knowing that your music is touching people. But I know that as a perfectionist,
it's kind of, for me, it's the same. It's like the opposite. I find seeing those comments, seeing people say that is. But then I just realised that I guess that's the tension that always exists between someone who's kind of making stuff and then putting it out in the world and the reception that it has. It's when I'm working on the music, I just don't. I kind of don't even see it as existing outside of myself. And then when it's out there, it kind of, I guess, takes on a sort of a whole other life. And I feel quite disengaged from it at that point, I guess.
Can you talk about this relationship between film, cinema, and music? Because you seem to release, they're beautiful short films and experimental films. And sometimes it's not clear whether it's a film with your music as a soundtrack or your music with an accompanying film. What's this relationship that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I always, I guess, like growing up, soundtrack music was always a huge influence, which is, I guess, the same thing as saying that film was, it's like film. My life was very much kind of like film was what I was into, and music and its role in film had a huge part in that. So I guess I was always influenced by the idea of music having a visual accompaniment or film having a musical accompaniment. When I started making music of my own, like again, this was like in the mid 2000s, I was intrigued by the idea of making a kind of a video to accompany it. And the first video that I made was the video for Save Yourself, which was just kind of clips of Iranian history, 20th century Iranian history kind of spliced together. And I did subsequently kind of like other videos that were similar, where it was just kind of historical footage cut together. And there are like obviously reasons why that's relatively easy to do, and also kind of why it's never going to be less than kind of incredible, because this is like actual historical footage. It's a bit of a cop-out, but it was a very easy way of making something that was always going to be interesting to watch, kind of compelling to watch, was always going to make the music sound, better. And after that, I guess I was lucky enough to know directors or kind of have contact with people who wanted to like make films to go with the music that I made, and that's kind of just continued like to this day. And with the stuff on this record, there are people that would just have got in touch and said like I listened to your music and I was wondering if you'd be interested in me putting together a video for it. That's happened various times, and the results have often been like absolutely astonishing. The video for We Can Be Ghosts now, which won like a major award for best animation at this UK Music Video Awards thing. The director for that, Tom, just got in touch with me and said, I'm an animator and I'm making stop motion animation. Be interested to know if you wanted me to make a video. And this, what came out of that was, it's just one of the greatest videos I've ever seen in any kind of like music video. So I don't have like a vision overall for the way that the visual kind of accompaniment to the music should work. I'm always open to those ideas, and I think it's just luck in that sense. I've just been lucky really with film and filmmakers, because I've got to work with some really amazing people.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one word to describe you as a person that we've never met, you're absolutely humble. Your music is amazing. The films that you produce are the films do exactly the same thing. They sort of transport you to another place. What about collaboration? I mean, the realm of the electronic musician is generally locked away by himself or herself in a dark room.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Funnily enough, recently I've been chatting to some musicians who got in touch for, I guess, like I basically just offered to speak to some people who might want advice, and a lot of the people that got in touch were kind of like what I thought would happen was they would send me music that this was like a kind of call to people who were just trying to find their sound or find their feet in what I assumed would be electronic music. And I figured I'd be getting sent like tracks to listen to and, requests for feedback. What do you think about this? Is this too loud? Is this too quiet? Is this well produced or not so well produced? But actually quite a few of them were just saying, I'm just kind of like hit a wall. Like, I'm just struggling to kind of find the sort of inspiration or the creativity is just gone. I think a lot of it was kind of related to the pandemic situation. I think a lot of them were just kind of feeling a bit flat, and like they said, like, I'm just not it's just not there at the moment. And so I found myself kind of trying to offer advice in that respect, which wasn't what I was thinking it would be. But one of the things that I said was like quite a lot was collaboration is always a great source of inspiration, for me, as I think for everyone. This record's probably the it's certainly like a very good example of it, just working with Faraz and Mal, channeling their incredible energies to create a record that was completely unlike what I expected it to be. But in the past, for me, again, like I am a very kind of like sort of solo worker, so I very much kind of like lock myself away and just do my thing in like a studio, not too far from here. But a lot, like regularly, I will meet with people. One friend of mine in particular, who's like a singer and a guitarist and a songwriter, and we'll just get together and just like basically rent a studio near where he lives and spend the day just kind of playing, you know, not with any aim or ambition, not to kind of, you know, not to kind of come up with something that's going to then get turned into something else, but just like to play. You know, we've been doing that since we were kids pretty much. And it's very easy to forget the joy in just, you know, performing is the wrong word, but just playing, you know, just kind of sitting there and improvising. We're both so comfortable with each other that we'll just kind of like, we'll be playing for like 20 minutes without saying anything, you know, we'll drift into one idea and then that will kind of turn into something else. And then maybe that won't work. So we'll just kind of move into something else. But like, you know, sometimes like an hour will go by and we just won't have said anything. We've just been sat there. We record it all on like a little recorder. And then, you know, ideas from that for both of us turn into whole other things for sure. But I think the act of just sitting down and making music for fun is so quickly lost. You know, it's so easy to forget that. So easy to forget that.
It's a really interesting thing for me, the idea that like technology now has made it so much easier for almost anybody to create anything. And so what that can lead to is pretty much like everyone using presets and just pumping out music that sounds like everybody else. Creativity, this word, how do you remain creative, authentic, and to create what's true for you?
I think that actually, and again, this is something that came up in a conversation with someone that I just through this same thing was chatting to online. I think it's really important to separate the creative part from the sort of refinement of the work. Like a producer got in touch with me and was talking about how kind of I mean, he didn't use the words bogged down, but I got the sense that he was like, you know, I start something and then I get bogged down in like EQing it. And it's like, you know, every time I'm writing a tune, I'm also simultaneously trying to kind of tweak it and turn it into, and I did suggest that for me, it's really important to separate the writing or the creating, whatever you want to call it, as a kind of sacred sort of space in which you do this is this thing which is separate entirely from the process of EQing and, you know, compressing and kind of fine tuning. That's work, you know. That can be fun too, but generally that's hours of, you know, that's kind of like science. It's like, you know, how does an EQ work? How does a compressor work? What are you actually doing here? Why are you making the vocal sound like this? But the minute that you start doing that, I think you disconnect with the creative part of it. It's like sort of, you know, it's like being constantly bombarded with like text messages during a conversation in a restaurant. You know, it's like you need to be kind of in constant like contact with this thing. It's so easily lost, you know. And also I think you need to be open to it. You need to be aware that like you might go down sort of 10 seemingly meaningless avenues before you suddenly stumble onto the one that sort of takes you to the ocean or whatever it is that you're looking for. So kind of a willingness to make what seem to be mistakes, you know, is I think also really important.
Yeah, I think that's not just for music, that's in any sort of artistic in my own filmmaking, 90% of what people would say were the best decisions I made were accidents. But you have to be open to embrace those accidents.
Absolutely, yeah.
I know you're a big fan of David Lynch, the filmmaker. But I'm going to ask you about creativity and ideas based on something that he says a lot. So he is a practitioner and ambassador, for want of a better word, of transcendental meditation. And he talks often about creating a creative space in which you allow ideas to sort of magically appear. And in his words, you need to be prepared almost like fishing. When you see the idea, you sort of, you put out the line and you catch that idea, and you treat that idea like magic, and you nurture it, and from there.
That's right, yeah.
How do you create sort of that space? Do you practice meditation? Do you have a sort of a maybe spiritual is the right word or not the right word, but is there some way that you actually get yourself into the space to be more receptive to creativity?
Yeah, I mean, I do try and meditate. I go through sort of periods of not doing it, and I kind of notice when I'm not doing it. It's kind of clear to me that I'm not in quite as good a state. I think the thing with David Lynch is I think he's an actual genius. So like, I think he's kind of like, in the same way that like, Van Gogh or, William Blake, he's a visionary. So I really like his, I like hearing him talk about how like, I'll just be meditating and then suddenly the entire sort of screenplay for like Wild at Heart will just be like there. I don't think ordinary people kind of have that experience. I think his relationship with creativity is very unique, which is great. I mean, it's just everything about him is really unique. But what I do find is that I think the thing that I find is that like those moments of connection with kind of creativity and ideas, as he calls them, which I think is a lot more applicable in kind of film and maybe writing. I think music is less ideas based, but that kind of what I think of as kind of creativity when I'm trying to write music can happen when I'm in a really like not good state of mind. There are times in my life when I've been really miserable, and I've found that music just kind of is a perfect sort of, it's like I'll just sit at the piano and just kind of make music. I don't know if it necessarily makes me feel better to do it, but like certainly the music that I'm writing feels incredibly right, feels incredibly kind of true. And again, this is something that Lynch says, is that like those kinds of feelings, like depression and anger and kind of nostalgia, they're great subjects for art, but they're kind of toxic for artists. So I think although you can make music or film or write when you're depressed, I think that eventually you kind of hit a wall. It's like drug use. It can be incredibly kind of creative, and then eventually you'll start to find that you're not really going anywhere. It's not kind of taking you anywhere. I think the thing about meditating is that like doing it regularly acts for me as like a sort of shield. It's like you sort of like you just kind of it's like going to a festival. You kind of come back and you're like, you carry a bit of it with you, for days afterwards. You feel like, wow, it's almost like I'm still there. It's like the way that I'm talking to people, the way that I'm seeing things. And I think that is what that allows you to do when you have that on board, when that's part of you and the way that you like exist. I think it just makes you okay with things working or not working in a way. Alternatively, if you're in a bad state of mind and you sit at the piano and it just nothing happens, you feel really terrible. Whereas if I don't know, like if I've been meditating and I'm looking after myself, I sit at the piano and nothing happens, I'm like, oh, I'll go and do something else. I'll go for a walk or go to a bookshop or whatever. So I don't necessarily think that it guarantees creativity. I think it just allows you to be creative or not be creative and just be okay with that. Maybe that's what happens with me anyway.
Yeah, it sounds like the more gentle you are with yourself, the more creative, perhaps.
I mean, I think that's kind of important, and I think that like, I was chatting to a close friend of mine last night who's also in a kind of DIY nightmare, and he's just saying, I had to give myself a day off. Like, it's just there's so much to do, but I just couldn't face it this morning. I just had to go to the park, and I just said, like, if we're going to do this kind of stuff, we have to be kind to ourselves. I think it's true with everything. I mean, we're much more. I certainly know myself and other people who do this kind of stuff. The way we treat ourselves, you would never dream of talking to a friend like that. you would never dream of expecting of someone else what you expect of yourself. I think that's kind of something that you just have to at least acknowledge that. Like, it's good to know that.
That's a dilemma of the perfectionist, of which I absolutely am. You have expectations on yourself that you would never dream to put on on anybody else. So we're living in 2020. In my lifetime, I've never lived through a period that seems so divided, so politically divided, so, you know, the almost inability to have conversations with people that don't agree entirely with what you think. What's the role of the artist in 2020 and beyond? The reason I started this podcast and the name Liminal Space. Liminal Space is referring to this sort of stage of transition, of change. What role does art play in perhaps bringing people together rather than continuing this divide?
That's a really good question, and I think that it's you know, it's funny because, again, I think something that came across from people that got in touch recently when I put out kind of a message and said anyone who's struggling as a musician, wants to get in touch, wants to kind of talk about their work or get some feedback on their work, to get in touch. A thing that kind of came up again and again was this sense of people kind of panicking that, like, oh, I just don't know, you know, with everything that's going on, I'm just not sure that, like, that I can really justify, like, trying to make music, or like make music, you know, make a living from music, or make a career from music. And of course, making a career from music is very, very kind of unpredictable and very, very difficult. But at the same time, you know, I feel like now more than ever, the role of art is clear. Like, the systems that we have in place to kind of make sense of the world don't work. You know, like the way that we try and the way that we try and structure a society, or, you know, our interactions with others, ultimately, I think, are obviously, you know, we have to go along with them because it's what we have. You can't just kind of shut it all out and go, I'm not having anything to do with this. But I think what we're witnessing is that we're kind of trapped. We've created this, like, prism for ourselves. Art is in a way, it's a kind of throwing up of your arms and going, do you know what? Like, none of that really makes sense. You know, the world is, you know, when we stick to the sort of template that we've created for how to kind of, like, deal with the world, we seem to destroy each other and ourselves and the world. You know, we're seeing it all around us. We're constantly in conflict, you know, with ourselves and each other. And art, I think, is the exception to that. It's like a sort of submission to something that, like, is a whole other system of being. You know, it's like, I'm not going to try and make sense of it. I'm just going to try and convey what it's like, you know. And I think that's more important now than ever. And it's more important that people do it, you know, not just for others, like to go, here's my, you know, my take on it, but for themselves. Because, you know, it's kind of, it's the only thing that really makes sense, is to just accept that nothing makes sense, and to try and sort of be with that, I think. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, absolutely. It's I don't know, you know, I think about these things often. I think about, through my own filmmaking, through music, you know, we see people doing other professions. We see people at the front line, you know, in hospitals and things like this. And at times, you know, sometimes art can be seen as just not contributing in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah. I think that can be the case, but I think it can contribute in high ways, very deep ways that can bring people together that, as you say, words cannot, language cannot, even logic cannot in some way.
Absolutely. I
mean, my own experience, I discovered electronic music 2 years ago. I'm 43 years old. I experienced being on a dance floor for 8 or 10 hours with people that I'd never met before, and the absolute, I can't even articulate that unity, that bond, that love, that just makes everything else just stupid. Like it makes fighting stupid. It makes nationalism stupid. It just sort of it's a crazy thing, and music and bringing people together is enormously powerful.
Yeah, I agree, and I hope that it will kind of continue to be that. I mean, I think we're, these are obviously huge questions, but I think it's maybe naive to think that we have some kind of like blueprint, sort of some template that like somewhere in the future we're going to reach like a state of like enlightenment or perfection, that we're not moving towards this thing. We're creatures that have evolved over millennia. We are still subject to like really base kind of instincts. When you see what we're doing to each other in the world, it's really not a million miles away. It's really easy to kind of root that in the sort of tribal aggressions of our ancestry, fighting for kind of dominance, for like primacy and power. That's all we've ever done, is like, try to stay alive, try to procreate, try to kind of like, and we're still doing that. We're still doing that on a kind of like global scale. We're just doing it with better kind of PR and technology. I think music allows us to step outside of that, and it hopefully allows other people to step outside of that, become less kind of controlled by their the kinds of feelings that they have just like in them. I know what this is like. I know what it feels like to kind of be sort of at the mercy of thoughts and feelings that I kind of don't really understand where they come from or what use they have. And music sometimes allows you to experience the world in another way. And it's a kind of powerful tool for that, certainly.
What about the role of the artist? I was on your Facebook page in the last couple of days in researching, and I saw that you had posted something vaguely political, but it wasn't musical. And there was more than one comment about, hey, I like you for your music, keep posting your music. And this for me is the really interesting question. What is the role of the artist in 2020 and beyond? Is it to be separated from politics and ideas and thought? Or, I mean, I don't think it is at all. Or is it to really use that platform to engage with issues and what you believe in, but at the fear or of losing fans, in a sense, that just want your music?
That's I think such a conundrum, and I think that like I think people are going to find their own answers to that. I think it really depends on who you are as a kind of an artist. For me personally, like there's nothing, I obviously the experience, I would love the experience at the center of the music that I make to be independent of politics generally, and for people to be able to put music on and just like have a kind of a moment with it that's kind of sort of transcendent of all the stuff that's going on in the world. But it's born stuff. I mean, none of us live independently of that in our day-to-day lives. I can't make a record about Iran that isn't going to make people go, oh, Iran, how do you feel about the Ayatollahs? And it was like, it's that stuff is always going to be sort of present. It's inescapable. The role, as far as the role of the artist goes, the problem with the world is that we are in this kind of like echo chamber. There is this, as you say, like cultural, this kind of like war going on where people are just fighting all the time. And the problem with that is that people kind of preempt their positions and they pick their sides. And then what they hear is either going to confirm or deny what they believe. And it's either going to fall in their camp or like the other camp. And I certainly don't want to be someone who's kind of trying to like dictate how people should think about things that go on in the world. I have my own like moral compass, you know, and I try and live by it. But I also accept that it's not right. I don't believe in an objective, like, you know, this isn't like absolutely. It's how I can make sense of the world in a way that I can sort of live with. Like, I totally understand that in the future, my values may be completely redundant due to any number of things that might happen to this world and the people that live on it. But at the moment, you know, I feel like there is a certain way that I have to live, and I think there are a lot of people that kind of feel the same way. So I don't want to ever like kind of preach those values. At least I'm going to try not to. But sometimes the world is so upsetting and so frustrating that you kind of can't hold your tongue. You just find it impossible. And I think everyone should be allowed to do that, whether they're artists or teachers or, you know, I think people should be within their rights to speak, you know.
And is that the reason that you separated, like your writing is done under your name and your music is done under HIATUS? Is that the reason to separate?
No, not really. Not kind of consciously. I guess I just, to be honest, I didn't really kind of have a theory as to why I wanted to kind of make music under a certain name. But funnily enough, I've been going through old books. I've got a whole pile of, I kept diaries for years and years. I didn't start until like 2001. I picked up a diary from 2001, which was the first diary. And I saw that I'd mentioned making music as hiatus, which really surprised me because I didn't start making music until electronic music until 2002 or 3. So it was really odd that I was like kind of saying, oh, you know, here's what I would like to be doing, you know, like a year from now. And part of it's making music as hiatus. So there was this idea of like I don't know, a pseudonym, but I don't see that necessarily as like having to kind of be a persona. I mean, I'm happy to be as kind of much a part of like my work as needs to be. Yeah. I mean, I like the sort of anonymity of it. I like the fact that it's not, you know, my name out there in that sense.
Yeah. And how does that work with, or what's your relationship to ego and fame, let's say? I mean, you are famous, you are very well known. How does that play in your daily life? And have you ever had to struggle with that ego aspect?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I think when it comes to fame, I mean, that is, I'm definitely in the camp that always, and I think this is actually really common, but I find that idea that I would ever be kind of well known or certainly famous comical. You know, I find that like hilarious. It's because, you know, and I guess that's kind of like partly the imposter syndrome thing. You know, it's like kind of always feeling like it just feels so. It just feels so odd to imagine that. In terms of like dealing with the stuff being out there, I think it's really important not to expect. Well, there's a saying that I think is like, don't expect applause. I think it's like a kind of some sort of some Buddhist thing. And I think it's a really good way to live. It doesn't matter what you're doing. I think by all means, like put everything you have into it, every kind of, you know, every part of yourself, and, you know, absolutely let it consume your life. Make it as good as you can, as kind of relevant and powerful as you can, but don't expect applause at the end of it. I find that the problem with social media in these respects, I mean, one of many problems with social media, is it makes it very hard to kind of, it changes your relationship with the work that you do. I think it's something that I think artists are kind of trying to get used to, the idea that you put something out and then immediately have this incredible sort of torrent of feedback within seconds, you know. And there were years when you'd put music out and there would be like a sort of a delay of weeks or months, or and reviews would come in, and now it's just like that's out and immediately you're bombarded with what people think about it. And that's it's addictive to I think anyone is fascinated by the reception to their work, and it's toxic because it completely warps how you feel about it. And I think that so in terms of kind of fame, which is, as I say, is a word that I'm really uncomfortable with, I try and do everything that I do completely independently of that idea. But as far as ego goes, I think independently of art, like, the ego is obviously a kind of a daily, it's a part of everyone's reality. I mean, we are all, we're all worshipping at the altar of ourself. And I think it's the root cause of pretty much all of the sadness in the world. This notion that we are kind of these little enclosed kind of beings, these kind of contained sort of conundrums. We buy into these kind of stories about ourselves, and it kind of helps us navigate the world that we live in, but it also just completely separates us from the experience of just being alive. Like, existence is not like a narrative arc with a sort of a beginning and a middle and an end. And the end is never, as far as I can tell, kind of a happy end, in the sense that stories, mythology has kind of convinced us to believe that it would be. Like, if we had a more, I mean, this, you were asking about philosophy earlier on. I mean, the philosophy that I try and live by is pretty much that, like, reality is kind of a chaos. I mean, it's in perfect harmony, like, nothing is wasted, everything is balanced, but our sense of it, filtered through language and kind of notions of, past and present and self and other and good and evil, all of that is a sort of a distorting lens, that we very quickly learn to view everything through. And we sort of lose our connection with, I think, everything. We just become lost in the story of our life and have absolutely zero empathy or very little empathy with the kind of common experience of being in this world.
And what about, just continuing on with that social media technology sort of theme, I think we're probably remotely around the same age, which would mean that we were brought up pre-Facebook and pre-smart anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your relationship to technology, both as a maker and then as a, for promotion and sort of as an artist?
Certainly as a music maker, I mean, I couldn't do what I do without the technology that I use. And I know that musicians in the past doing the kind of the equivalent of what I would do would have incredible trouble putting together the music that they make, and composers obviously would write scores that they would not hear until they assembled the musicians to play it, other than in their heads. And then they would get the whole orchestra together and listen to it and go, oh no, that doesn't work at all. It's like, I can put ideas together on a computer and listen to them as I'm doing it. That's obviously a huge blessing, and I would probably, well, who knows what I would be doing if it wasn't for that. But that I'm very grateful for. In terms of the sort of media, I'm not like I'm not a technology person generally, and I'm really, I try not to be grumpy, but I find traveling around London, and seeing everyone just kind of staring at their phones and listening to music on their phones, public transport, like listening to, making people endure the sort of tinny kind of speaker renditions of whatever music they like, or having conversations with their, I find it kind of it just seems like another level of kind of distraction, another level of, the album Distancer, the title Distancer, is kind of like a nod to the sort of like distancing effect of the things that we kind of take on in our lives, how we get further and further away from what I would consider to be a kind of, personal opinion, but like a kind of a truthful, or like at least kind of pure experience of being alive. And yeah, at the same time, I'm totally addicted to it as well. You know, I don't have any apps on my phone. My phone is like kind of laughed at by people that are into phones. But of course, I too feel that kind of constant nagging need to know if someone's messaged me or like, responded to an email or what's happened on Twitter. I think anyone who has Twitter or uses Twitter and doesn't have that constant nagging need just probably isn't using it like to the extent that certainly the people that made it want you to use it. I mean, the logical conclusion of those platforms and those kind of media experiences is a kind of total immersion in them. I did an interview with someone years ago, a guy called Ray Kurzweil, who's a sort of futurist and inventor and technological wizard. And he wrote a book about virtual reality, about a thing called the singularity, which is like the kind of merging of humanity and technology, which he predicted or predicts will happen in a kind of fairly kind of sort of near future. And at the time I was like, living in a virtual reality, I just don't see it happening. And then kind of after a while I was like, well, we're sort of doing it. I mean, people seem to spend more time in the worlds, in the device, in their pocket than they do in the world, at least as far as they're conscious. Their energies are directed to this version of themselves that interacts with other people on an app, on their phone or on their computer, than the world that surrounds them. I mean, we're kind of doing it now, I suppose.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. We're doing it.
And again, this is an example of the positive power of it. For as far as I'm concerned, this is like an example of the good. I think the problem is that it becomes an escape from when the world out there seems intolerable. It's like when that world is, and this is a kind of a premise of a lot of dystopian science fiction, is that like, the world becomes unbearable. So people retreat to a kind of, it's like Ready Player One type thing. It's like, you kind of spend all your time in a sort of virtual alternative to what's out there, Matrix like.
But do you feel as an artist you actually have a choice when you release, my understanding is you release your music independently, doesn't that,
that's right, yeah.
Do you now not have the choice to not be on social media because that's your avenue to, or is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's pretty true. I mean, I don't see that I could really disengage from it in terms of kind of, certainly at this point. And I wouldn't necessarily want to. I mean, I'm really grateful for the obviously the feedback that I get and the kind of communication that I have with people that listen to what I do, and it is incredible. It is mostly really positive, and I wouldn't give that up for sure. I'm definitely kind of stuck with doing it for a while longer, but I'm glad to have that.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. Thanks so much for taking the time. I mean, me personally, I could ask you so many more questions and
it's been a great joy, mate. It's been a real pleasure.
Could go forever. I just wouldn't mind just finishing on two things, if you don't mind. The first is
sure.
Just where you are right now. You've finished an album. What's that like after however many weeks, months, possibly years of work, and you're getting ready to share that with audiences? What's that sort of feeling like?
I actually think it varies record to record. I mean, I think that ultimately, the immediate aftermath of finishing a project like this, and I'm sure it's true with all art, is one of kind of despair. Like, it's like your life is absolutely kind of dominated by this thing, and then it's gone, and you find yourself in a kind of free fall. And it's not like the thing is out there and people are really enjoying it. It's like you're just kind of pretending it doesn't exist. It's just like there on your hard drive or whatever. I mean, I know other artists. In fact, most of the people I know who do music certainly find the immediate aftermath to finishing a record really like depressing. Certainly that's been my experience of it. The immediate aftermath is really, really hard. And I tend to kind of find something to do. I mean, hence this like really ill-advised DIY thing. I have to find something to do to kind of fill the time, because otherwise I just ruminate on it and kind of find myself regretting things that I did or didn't do. This record as a whole, generally better. I'm excited about this record. And I think, again, a big part of that is probably the collaborative aspect of it. It doesn't feel like just me in a room. You know, I'm excited about people hearing Faraz and Mal. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to people hearing it.
And when do you know when a track or when an album is done?
Oh, it's never done. It's never finished. I mean, it's, there's a teacher that I had as a kid, English teacher, said a poem is never finished, it is only abandoned. And I remember as a kid kind of not really getting it, but it was just one of those things that stayed with me. You know, it's like when you're that age, you're just like a sponge. And I genuinely didn't really know what he meant. And then later when I started doing music, I was like, I know, I get it now. Like, you don't ever... And then I realized that actually that had been true with everything that I'd done. You know, I kind of just worried it. I mean, I know people that are really good at just kind of making something and just going, that's done. That's finished, and I'm leaving it there. But for me, I continue to kind of chip away at it until I collapse. And it's always been the way. Every record I've ever made has kind of driven me to, you know, almost kind of like physical illness. You know, this one, I booked a week in a good studio to mix it, and I was like, I'm just going, not to mix it, sorry, to master it. You know, I spent 6 months kind of mixing it, and then it was like, I'm going to go into the studio and then just kind of send the final mixes and get the masters back, make little tweaks and stuff. That turned into like 3 weeks. And then after 3 weeks, I was just like, if I don't stop now, I'm going to go, you know, bad. Things are going to get bad. Things are going to go wrong. So I don't think, everyone's going to be different, but for me, it's just when the alternative. I think sometimes you're just presented with like 2 scenarios and you just have to pick one, you know. And sometimes you just think, well, that one is not an option, so I'm going to have to do that. And that's always the point when I stop. I'm like, I can't be that person tomorrow. So that's the end of it. It's finished.
And that brings me to another question about choice. Do you find that limiting choices or putting barriers around things actually increases creativity, or does it make it more difficult?
I think you need those kind of barriers. I mean, the thing with the music that I do is that there is a kind of tendency for me to fit it around these kind of like skeletal frames that correspond to certain, like, I don't know, BPMs, or kind of, you know, it's like a certain kind of pattern of musical rise and fall. Those kind of templates, I think, are enjoyable. You know, it's fun. It's like writing to a poetic form. But I also like the idea of things being at the same time completely open. So, you know, I've been recently really interested. In fact, this record, I started using this field recorder to go out and kind of record sounds from mostly London. Just going out in London and recording train stations and foyers of public buildings and swimming pools, and then kind of using those sounds in the music that I was making. And it just kind of like those sorts of those kinds of choices, that I think that sort of thing can open everything up in ways that no kind of like frame can do. I think you need to have like a framework within to work, but you also kind of want to be completely open to experience and allow the world in at the same time.
Thank you. You have allowed the world in to yourself and your creative process. And what can I say? We've never met, but our contact and this chat, it's a absolute reflection on the authenticity of your music and you are the anti-rock star in a sense.
Oh, thanks, mate. Yeah.
You know, like to be able to have this chat, I know we all deal with egos and all, you know, deal with these sorts of things, but be so open and so honest and to reply to me in the way that you did is nothing but a very beautiful thing. And thank you for everyone that's going to hear and watch this. And
it's been a great pleasure, mate. I would also like to say also, it's been a great pleasure listening to your music. And, I meant what I said about it. And I hope that everyone who watches this knows that you are yourself a musician, because your stuff is really good. So I hope that you're getting as many people listen to it as you deserve to as well.
That's amazing. Thank you. I don't consider myself a musician yet, but we're well on the way. And yeah, I really hope also that people that don't yet know your music that watch and listen to this can discover that as well. So I'll put all sorts of links to your music and your blog and your writing as well. And
very great.
Yeah, thanks again, and hope to meet you one day in person.
I hope so too. Cool. Thank you.
All right, Cyrus.
All right, too.
Ciao. Many thanks for watching. I'd love for you to be notified of new episodes, so subscribe and hit the bell button below. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. You can also visit liminalspace.earth to discover all episodes. But for now, many thanks again, and I'll see you next time in a liminal space.